Let me start with something most people completely missed. While the country was distracted by holiday headlines, end-of-year chaos, and the usual political noise, one of the biggest shifts in U.S. immigration and foreign policy in decades quietly unfolded behind the scenes. It didn't dominate the news cycle. It wasn't debated on every morning show, but it happened, and it is already reshaping America's national security landscape. Because while the public wasn't paying attention, President Trump delivered a series of coordinated moves that stunned Washington insiders. He issued a hardline ultimatum to Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, paused asylum decisions across the United States indefinitely, and signaled a sweeping reversal in the nation's approach to migration. A reversal so dramatic that he claims it will change the future of American neighborhoods, American borders, and American security, not years from now, but immediately. Now, most Americans still have no idea this happened. That's because these weren't isolated decisions. They were deeply connected steps, each tied to rising national security concerns, fraud investigations, and shifting geopolitical pressures. Today, we're going to break down exactly what Trump announced, why it matters far more than most people realize, and what it means for the country moving forward. Let's begin with the announcement that caught foreign leaders completely off guard. Trump didn't send a diplomat, an envoy, or a carefully worded memo. He personally picked up the phone and called Nicolas Maduro, the embattled and controversial leader of Venezuela. This was not a polite diplomatic check-in. This was a direct, high-stakes ultimatum delivered from the Oval Office straight to Caracas. Trump's message was unmistakably blunt. Step down from power immediately. Resign your position, and the United States will guarantee safe passage for you and your family out of Venezuela. This, he said, was Maduro's one and only chance to exit peacefully. Think about the weight of that. A sitting U.S. president telling another nation's leader, essentially, your time is up. Leave now or face the consequences. That's not traditional diplomacy. That's leverage. That's geopolitical pressure. And it reveals just how serious the situation in Venezuela has become in the eyes of U.S. leadership. But here's where things get even more surprising. According to sources familiar with the conversation, Maduro didn't immediately reject the offer or hang up the phone in anger. Instead, he responded with two very specific requests. First, he asked for more time, a face-saving exit that would allow him to claim he wasn't being forced out by Washington. Second, he wanted to step down as president, but maintain control of Venezuela's military forces. As you can imagine, that proposal did not go over well. Trump rejected both requests outright. The United States was not interested in half measures or power sharing, arrangements that kept Maduro's influence intact. The goal, according to the Trump administration, was genuine regime change, a clean transition of power that would allow a new government to stabilize the country and reestablish cooperation with the West. A follow-up call was scheduled for that same weekend, a crucial conversation expected to finalize Maduro's decision, but that call never happened. Maduro simply didn't show up. No communication, no explanation, just silence. And in diplomacy, silence often speaks louder than words. Behind the scenes, analysts believe Maduro was either digging in his heels or scrambling to determine his next move. Was he consulting with Russia, China? Was he trying to gauge whether Trump was bluffing? Whatever the reason, the vacuum of communication only heightened tensions. And in Washington, unresolved tensions typically lead to escalation. That's when Trump announced a major national address, specifically about Venezuela. This wasn't a press briefing. This wasn't a quick tweet. This was an Oval Office address, the type reserved for moments of significant foreign policy consequence. Overnight, speculation exploded. Why Venezuela? Why now? And what exactly was Trump preparing to say? To understand the stakes, we need context. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, larger even than Saudi Arabia. Yet decades of corruption, mismanagement, and authoritarian rule have driven the country into economic collapse. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. Millions fled the country. Basic food and medicine shortages became the norm. Entire neighborhoods emptied out, families leaving with nothing but bags on their backs. If the United States could help broker a legitimate transition of power, it could unlock enormous economic potential. American companies could negotiate new energy access. Trade could restart. The Venezuelan economy could be rebuilt. And here's the stunning part. Trump believes that if Venezuela stabilizes, millions of Venezuelans living abroad, including hundreds of thousands in the U.S., may ultimately return home. This is what he began calling reverse migration. But Venezuela was only the opening act. Trump then tied the situation directly into a broader immigration strategy, one that few saw coming. He argued that the United States can no longer sustain the constant inflow of migrants, legal or illegal, without fundamentally reshaping the system. His solution? Reverse migration, encouraging or requiring people who arrived during recent years, particularly under the Biden administration, to return to their home countries once stability is restored. Now, many Americans wonder whether such a massive reversal is even possible. Trump's argument is that if you fix the source of the instability, if you restore order in countries like Venezuela, people will voluntarily go home because they no longer have to flee chaos. However, reverse migration was only the second shock. The third one hit far closer to home. Trump ordered an indefinite pause on all asylum decisions across the United States. Not delays, not slowdowns, a complete freeze. USCIS halted in-person asylum interviews. Processing stopped. No timeline, no expiration date. When reporters pressed for a time frame, Trump responded, "A long time. Could be a very long time." This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a hard policy shift rooted in recent national security scares, cases that shook federal agencies. 2 Afghan nationals admitted under Operation Allies Welcome. The program launched during the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, were involved in violent or potentially violent acts in the U.S. In Washington, D.C., one of them shot 2 National Guard members. In Texas, another posted videos showing himself constructing an apparent explosive device with threats targeting the Fort Worth area. Both had entered the country under a program that was supposed to protect our allies. Yet both incidents exposed cracks in the rushed vetting process. Now it must be said clearly, the vast majority of Afghan evacuees have committed no crimes and are simply trying to rebuild their lives. But in national security, it only takes one incident to raise alarms, and 2 incidents so close together triggered an immediate reassessment of the entire program. Then came another shocking revelation. Investigators discovered that FBI and federal crime databases categorize people from countries like Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Morocco as white. This outdated classification, rooted in 1940s regulations, means entire groups have been misrepresented in crime statistics for decades. Analysts warn that this mislabeling distorts terrorism assessments, skews demographic reports, and hides important patterns. It raises serious questions about the accuracy of data used by policymakers and the media. But perhaps the most jaw-dropping development came out of Minnesota. While the national debate raged over borders and asylum, investigators uncovered one of the largest fraud schemes in U.S. history, a multi-billion-dollar operation involving shell companies, fake clinics, and fraudulent claims to state and federal programs. Much of the scheme was tied to networks within the state's Somali community, exploiting programs designed to help vulnerable children and families. We're not talking about a few fraudulent forms. We're talking about a massive, coordinated network submitting tens of thousands of fake claims for child therapy, autism services, nutrition assistance, mental health care, and housing support. Money intended for struggling families was siphoned off and, in some cases, sent overseas, including transfers linked to extremist groups like Al-Shabaab, according to federal prosecutors. For years, this enormous fraud remained hidden. Media outlets avoided the story, possibly out of political discomfort or fear of backlash. But evidence continued piling up until the truth could no longer be ignored. Arrests were made, charges were filed, and suddenly even national newspapers could no longer look away. Taken together, the ultimatum to Venezuela, the asylum freeze, the national security incidents, the FBI database scandal, and the multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. Trump argues that these events show a system collapsing under its own weight, a system that needs drastic correction, not minor adjustments. And these actions, whether you agree with them or not, represent one of the most significant shifts in U.S. immigration and foreign policy in a generation. A shift that Trump claims will restore stability at home and abroad, and critics claim will destabilize millions of lives. What happens next? That is the question hovering over Washington. Because Venezuela is still in chaos, asylum cases remain frozen, investigations continue, and the nation is deeply divided over what these policies represent: security, cruelty, or a new direction for America's future. If you restore order in countries like Venezuela, people will voluntarily go home because they no longer have to flee chaos. Times had no choice but to cover it. The story had grown too large, too undeniable, too explosive to ignore. Their headline hit like a political earthquake. How fraud swamped Minnesota's social services system on Tim Walz's watch. And that's significant, because this didn't come from a right-leaning blog or a conservative media outlet. This came from the New York Times, publication that usually bends over backward to avoid giving Republicans ammunition. Yet here they were, directly pointing the finger at Minnesota's Democratic governor, Tim Walz, and accusing his administration of failing to stop the largest fraud scheme in the state's history. That headline alone set the stage for a political storm. Reporters, commentators, and even lawmakers wanted answers. Billions of taxpayer dollars had been stolen. Not thousands, not millions, billions, and all of it happened on Walz's watch. So when journalists finally cornered him, asking the most basic of leadership questions, do you take responsibility? Everyone expected some level of acknowledgement, some sign of accountability, but that's not what they got. Instead of accepting responsibility, instead of even offering a symbolic apology, Governor Walz sidestepped the question. He said, "Certainly I take responsibility for putting people in jail. Governors don't just talk theoretically. We have to solve problems." It was a polished answer, rehearsed, politically safe. But then he added something that stunned the room. He accused the reporters of trying to demonize an entire community and called their questions lazy. And with that, the narrative shifted, not toward accountability, not toward solutions, but toward accusations of racism. It's a pattern Americans have watched unfold again and again. The moment someone raises legitimate concerns, especially about sensitive topics like immigration or government oversight, the conversation shuts down. The person asking the question becomes the problem, not the failure being questioned. But here's what people need to understand. Nobody asked Governor Walz to demonize anyone. Nobody asked him to generalize or paint entire communities with the same brush. They asked him a simple leadership question. How did billions of dollars get stolen under your administration? And why did state agencies miss warning signs so massive they might as well have been flashing neon billboards? Because the fraud was very real. So were the arrests. So was the stolen money. This wasn't some myth cooked up on social media. Federal prosecutors laid out detailed evidence in court, filings that read like the plot of a crime thriller, shell companies with non-existent addresses, clinics that didn't exist, children diagnosed with autism who weren't real, entire therapy programs fabricated out of thin air. One man discovered that more than $200,000 had been billed under his name for autism therapy he never received from a company he had never heard of. While he was living overseas in Kenya, when he confronted the organization, they blamed it on a clerical error, promised an internal review, and moved on. But the money? Already paid out. Already gone. Dozens upon dozens of similar cases surfaced. Some schemes targeted Medicaid, others exploited pandemic-era nutrition programs meant to feed school children. Still others drained money from mental health initiatives, housing assistance, and state-level welfare programs. The fraud was so widespread, so structurally sophisticated, that investigators eventually concluded this wasn't random opportunism. It was coordinated, organized crime masquerading as social services. And when investigators followed the money trail, a significant portion of it didn't stay in Minnesota. It didn't stay in the U.S. at all. It flowed overseas, including transfers directly to Somalia. Even more troubling, federal authorities traced some funds into the hands of Al-Shabaab, a known terrorist organization aligned with Al-Qaeda. That revelation changed everything. This wasn't just welfare fraud anymore. This was a national security threat, which is why, suddenly, Trump's broader immigration and security announcements started to make a lot more sense to a lot more people. Americans who were previously skeptical began connecting the dots. Border policy wasn't an abstract debate. It wasn't about compassion versus cruelty. It was about vulnerabilities in a system that had been blind to exploitation for far too long. But Trump didn't stop at fraud or foreign policy. In a move that caught even some of his longtime supporters off guard, he raised the issue of denaturalization, the legal revocation of U.S. citizenship. Historically, denaturalization is extremely rare. It's usually reserved for cases of outright fraud during the citizenship process or for individuals who waged war against the United States, Trump suggested expanding that standard. He argued that if someone becomes a U.S. citizen but spends their time undermining the country, attacking its values, or supporting hostile entities, the government should have the legal right to revoke that citizenship. No one expected him to go that far publicly, but then he pointed to specific examples that every viewer instantly recognized. He mentioned Somalia, a country with no functioning national government and deep ties to ongoing extremist activity, and then referenced a sitting member of Congress who he claimed had married her brother to enter the United States. He didn't say the name aloud, but everyone knew exactly who he meant: Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Omar has long been one of the most polarizing political figures in America, accused, though never formally charged, of immigration fraud, accused of anti-Semitic rhetoric, openly critical of U.S. foreign policy, and often portraying America as an oppressive and unjust country. She has built her political brand on defiance. Trump looked at that record and asked a blunt question. Why should someone who hates this country get to represent it? It's a controversial argument, but it raises profound questions about the obligations of citizenship. Is citizenship simply a legal status? Or does it carry expectations, loyalty, shared values, a commitment to the common good? The U.S. has never fully answered that question, and Trump's comments forced it back into the national conversation. This connects with Trump's broader theme, America's identity crisis. He argues that the country is at a crossroads, torn between radical inclusivity and the loss of its cultural cohesion. According to him, the U.S. has become so terrified of being labeled intolerant that it stopped expecting assimilation. Entire communities now live for decades in America without learning English, without sharing cultural values, without integrating into the fabric of American society. And Trump sees that as unsustainable. He points to hard data. The foreign-born population in the U.S. is now at the highest percentage in history, even higher than during the Ellis Island era. 1 in 6 Americans today was born somewhere else, over 50 million people. Immigration itself isn't the issue. America has always been a nation of immigrants. The issue, Trump argues, is the breakdown of the social contract that once made assimilation inevitable. In the past, immigrants came to America to become Americans. Today, he says, many come to access benefits funded by taxpayers who are struggling themselves. And here's the data point that infuriates millions. Over half of foreign-born households rely on at least one government assistance program. Whether the perception is fair or not, it drives political behavior. It shapes elections. And Trump has built his movement by saying the quiet part out loud. Now zoom out. Look at Venezuela, the geopolitical domino that could reshape the entire hemisphere. Why is Trump willing to pressure Nicolas Maduro directly? Because Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. But decades of authoritarian rule turned a wealthy nation into an economic wasteland. If Maduro falls and a pro-Western government stabilizes the country, the strategic benefits for the U.S. are enormous. Energy independence, regional influence, economic partnerships, and just as importantly, the possibility of reverse migration. Millions of Venezuelans returning home voluntarily once stability returns. That reshapes migration flows across South America and directly affects U.S. border pressure. But Venezuela is just one piece. The asylum freeze is another. Trump made it clear there is no timeline, no automatic review, no scheduled reevaluation. The freeze is indefinite. Thousands of families now sit in limbo. Border towns must adapt. Immigration courts slow to a crawl, and enforcement actions are ramping up, not only for illegal immigrants, but possibly even for naturalized citizens if denaturalization gains legal traction. The ripple effects are enormous. Economically, socially, culturally, America is entering a period of profound transformation, whether people realize it or not. Trump's announcements signal a turning point, a recalibration of national identity and national security priorities. And the decisions made now will shape the America that future generations inherit. We are living in a moment of historic change, a moment where political boundaries are being redrawn, where immigration policy intersect with national security, where cultural expectations collide with demographic reality. And whether one supports or opposes Trump, there's no denying that his announcements have forced the country to confront questions it has avoided for decades. That's why conversations like this matter. Not the sound bites, not the headlines. The deeper context beneath the surface. the part most people never hear.